skipped my son's funeral for a vacation. So I sent her to prison. My daughter-in-law didn't show up at my son's funeral. Hours later, she posted a picture of herself drinking cocktails on a white sand beach with the gardener. The caption said, "Enjoy life while you can." That was the exact moment I received a text message from my son and froze in my tracks. "Dad, come to my house now." But my son had been legally dead for 3 days. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 72 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life dealing with heavy, load-bearing structures. As a veteran structural engineer, I know exactly how much immense weight a massive steel beam can take before it violently snaps. I know that reinforced concrete is incredibly strong under compression, but fatally weak under sudden tension. But standing there in the freezing, relentless Seattle rain at Oakwood Cemetery, watching the polished mahogany casket of my only son, Lucas, being lowered into the wet, dark mud, I realized I knew absolutely nothing about the breaking point of a human heart. The rain in Seattle does not wash things away. It just makes the mud significantly heavier. It makes the sea of black umbrellas held by the mourners look exactly like a flock of impatient vultures waiting for a feast. I stood alone at the very edge of the open grave, my weathered hands clasped tightly behind my back. I did this not because I was calm, but because I was terrified that if I let go, my entire physical structure would collapse into the dirt. I was wearing the stiff black suit Lucas had generously bought me for his wedding 5 years ago. It felt incredibly tight across the shoulders now, or perhaps the crushing weight of the world was just pressing down much harder today. To my immediate left stood Sterling, my corporate attorney, and my oldest living friend. He held a large black umbrella over my head, but I could still feel the bitter dampness seeping deeply into my bones. To my right was a single, empty metal folding chair. It was the chair traditionally reserved for the grieving widow. The expensive velvet cushion was getting completely soaked by the heavy rain, turning a dark, soggy, depressing gray. That empty chair screamed much louder than any wail of genuine grief ever could. It was a massive void, a black hole, right in the middle of the solemn ceremony, that sucked all the dignity out of the moment. I could hear the others whispering behind me, the business partners, the wealthy investors from Lucas's highly successful cybersecurity firm. They foolishly thought the sound of the rain and the priest's monotonous drone covered their voices. But I have spent 40 years on loud construction sites, specifically listening for the faint crack of a failing bolt over the deafening roar of jackhammers. "My hearing is just fine. Where is she?" One of them whispered. It was a man in an expensive navy blue suit, likely Lucas's chief financial officer. "Maybe she is too grief-stricken to come," the woman next to him replied, though her hushed tone dripped heavily with obvious sarcasm. "Grief-stricken, my ass," the man scoffed quietly. "She is probably meeting with the estate lawyers right now." Lucas left behind a $10 million life insurance policy and the sole patent for the new data encryption chip. That crying widow act only lasts until the first check officially clears. I tightened my iron grip on my own wrist behind my back. My knuckles turned a stark bone white. I desperately wanted to turn around and shout at them. I wanted to fiercely demand they show some damn respect for the brilliant man who had built their massive fortunes. Lucas was a certified genius. He was not like me. I built massive physical bridges with cold steel and hard sweat. He built invisible, impenetrable fortresses with complex code and pure logic. He was soft where I was hard. He was inherently trusting where I was eternally skeptical. And right now, his final tragic exit from this world was being turned into a cheap gossip session simply because his wife could not be bothered to show her face. The elderly priest solemnly threw the first handful of wet dirt onto the mahogany casket. The sound was a dull, incredibly hollow thud. It sounded exactly like a heavy vault door closing forever. I took a deep, shaky breath, inhaling the sharp scent of wet pine and funeral lilies. I looked around the crowd, searching for a reason, any valid reason. Finally, my tired eyes landed on Mrs. Gable, Monica's mother. She was standing nervously near the back of the crowd, huddled tightly under a large golf umbrella, actively trying to make herself completely invisible. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses, even though the Seattle sky was the dark color of a bruised plum. As the solemn service ended, and people began to quickly drift away toward their luxury cars, muttering generic, hollow condolences to me as they passed. I walked straight toward her. My heavy work boots sank deeply into the soft grass. I moved with the intense, unyielding purpose of a site foreman walking toward a critical safety violation. Mrs. Gable saw me coming. She flinched. I saw it clearly, a tiny, involuntary jerk of her thin shoulders. She tried to force a polite smile, but her heavily lipsticked lips were trembling visibly. "Harrison," she said, her voice high, thin, and remarkably unstable. "I am so incredibly sorry. This is a tragedy, a complete, unimaginable tragedy. Where is she?" I asked. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. My voice is naturally like grinding gravel. It carries perfectly. "She is devastated, Harrison, just completely devastated," Mrs. Gable stammered, clutching her expensive leather purse to her chest like a physical shield. "She collapsed this morning in the foyer. She could not even physically get out of bed. We had to take her to a private, highly exclusive clinic downtown. The doctors immediately sedated her. She wanted to be here so badly, Harrison, but her heart. She just could not handle the extreme stress of seeing him lowered into the ground." I looked at this woman. I looked at the exact way her eyes nervously darted to the left, deliberately avoiding mine. I looked at the way her manicured fingers tapped an anxious rhythm on the gold clasp of her bag. "A bag my dead son most likely paid for. Which clinic?" I asked, my tone flat and uncompromising. "I will go visit her right after this." "No," she said, entirely too quickly. "No visitors. The head doctors said she needs absolute isolation and complete, uninterrupted rest. She will call you the moment she wakes up. Please, Harrison, do not cause a scene today." She loved Lucas so much. I wanted to believe her. God help me. I really wanted to believe her, because the alternative was that my only son had died foolishly loving a complete monster. The dark alternative was that the beautiful woman he worshipped, the woman he constantly defended every single time I called her selfish and entitled, was literally spitting on his fresh memory. So I slowly nodded. I chose the lie. It was a massive structural weakness in my own judgment, but I chose it simply to keep from collapsing right there in the graveyard mud. "I understand," I said quietly, masking my deep suspicion. "Tell her I hope she recovers." I turned away and walked back to my truck. It was an old, beat-up Ford F-150. Lucas used to constantly beg me to trade it in for something modern with heated seats and proximity sensors, but I liked the absolute simplicity of it. I liked machines I could actually fix with a wrench and some elbow grease. I sat heavily in the driver's seat and pulled the door shut, finally shutting out the relentless rain. The silence in the cab was deafening. I looked over at the passenger seat. There was a small, green plastic dinosaur sitting there. A cheap toy my grandson, Leo, had left behind the very last time they visited. Leo, where was he? Mrs. Gable hadn't mentioned the boy at all. Was my grandson sitting in the waiting room of this fictitious clinic? Too. A sudden crushing wave of physical exhaustion hit me. I leaned my heavy head back against the worn headrest and closed my eyes tightly. I was 72 years old. I was completely alone. My beautiful wife had passed away 10 years ago, and now my brilliant boy was gone. I felt exactly like an ancient condemned building that had drastically outlasted its original purpose, just quietly waiting for the heavy wrecking ball to strike. My smartphone buzzed in my breast pocket. I ignored it. It was probably just another generic condolence text from a distant cousin who didn't know what to actually say. It buzzed again and again, a rapid, annoying staccato vibration against my chest. I sighed heavily and pulled it out. My fingers were stiff and aching from the cold dampness. I wiped a stray drop of rain off the glass screen. It was an Instagram notification. Lucas had manually installed the app on my phone years ago, so I could easily see pictures of Leo growing up. I never really knew how to use it properly, but the push notifications always popped up on the lock screen. User Monica Caldwell just added to their story. My thick thumb hovered uncertainly over the screen. Mrs. Gable had just looked me in the eye and solemnly sworn she was heavily sedated. She said she was recovering in a private clinic. I tapped the notification. The screen brightened instantly, cutting through the gloom of the truck cab. It wasn't a sterile hospital room. It was blue, bright, piercing, vibrant turquoise blue. The ocean, the high-resolution image loaded fully. It was a selfie. Monica was wearing a tiny white bikini that barely covered anything. She was holding a large, frosted glass with a salted rim and a lime wedge. and casually leaning in right next to her, his chest completely bare and glistening with tanning oil, was Jax. Jax was the 25-year-old personal trainer and landscape gardener Lucas had hired last summer. The exact man I had firmly warned Lucas about, because I had seen the way he looked at Monica with hungry, predatory eyes when he thought no one was watching. They were smiling. No, not just smiling. They were laughing. Monica's head was thrown back in the photo, her mouth wide open in a roar of absolute unburdened delight. I stared intensely at the digital timestamp in the corner. 2 minutes ago, I stared at the location tag, the Ritz-Carlton Cancun, and then I read the caption written in bold, arrogant white letters across the very bottom of the photo. Enjoy life while you can. Freedom tastes like tequila. All the remaining air violently left my lungs. It physically felt like I had been brutally punched in the gut by a 10-pound sledgehammer. The lie didn't just crack. It completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She wasn't sick. She wasn't grieving. She was actively celebrating. My only son was currently being covered with 6 feet of wet dirt, and his loving wife was on a tropical honeymoon with the hired help, spending his life insurance money before his body was even cold. My hands started to shake. A rage so incredibly hot and pure boiled up inside my chest that my vision actually blurred at the edges. I felt bitter bile rise in the back of my throat. I desperately wanted to drive straight to the international airport. I wanted to fly down there and violently drag her out of that luxury hotel by her hair. But then, the phone buzzed again. It was not a social media notification this time. It was a standard text message. I looked at the sender ID, and my heart completely stopped beating. Lucas, I blinked rapidly. I wiped my eyes, firmly believing the unshed tears were playing cruel visual tricks on me. But the name remained boldly on the screen. Lucas, I opened the message with a trembling finger. Dad, help me. Come to the house now. Do not let her know. Enter code Omega. I stared at the words glowing on the small screen. The phone slipped from my suddenly numb fingers and clattered onto the dirty floor mats of the truck. I sat there frozen, my mind completely short-circuiting, while the heavy rain hammered against the metal roof of the truck like 1,000 accusing fingers. Lucas was dead. I had personally identified the body in the county morgue. I had seen the horrific charred remains from the terrible highway car crash. So, who in the hell was currently texting me from his personal number? Was this an incredibly cruel, sophisticated prank? Was Monica trying to drive me completely insane before she legally took my money and the estate? Or was there something else? Something deeply buried, far deeper than my son in that wet grave. I reached down and picked up the phone. I looked at the message one more time. Code Omega. I knew that exact code. It was the absolute emergency override protocol for his massive home security system. It was a fail-safe code he had sworn only he and I knew. The timestamp on the text said, "Now delivered 1 minute ago." A wild, completely impossible hope violently flared in my chest, warring with the cold, hard logic of my engineer's mind. What if? What if the burned body in the car was not him? What if the terrible accident was elaborately staged? The message said, "Do not trust anyone." Did that mean the police? The county coroner? Sterling? I looked out the driver's side window. The cemetery was nearly empty now, just the muddy graveyard workers, waiting impatiently to fill the massive hole. I felt a sudden, intense paranoid urge to hide. If Lucas was somehow alive, someone had obviously tried to kill him. And if he was reaching out to me, I was now officially part of the target. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and violently twisted the key in the ignition. The old truck's engine roared to life, a rough, dependable sound that instantly grounded me. I didn't care about the local speed limit. I didn't care about the slick, wet asphalt. I slammed the heavy gear shift into drive and peeled out of the lot, the rear tires screeching loudly in protest. My heart pounded a frantic, erratic rhythm much louder than the roaring engine. I was driving toward a ghost. I was driving toward a trap, I didn't know which, but as I merged onto the busy highway, speeding toward the sprawling, expensive estate my son called home, the heavy grief that had paralyzed me was instantly replaced by a cold, steely resolve. I was not just a grieving father anymore. I was a man on a mission, and if my son was calling for help from beyond the grave, I would eagerly tear down the solid iron gates of hell to answer him. The house loomed out of the darkness at the end of the cul-de-sac, like a grounded spaceship made entirely of tinted glass and black steel. Lucas had spent $5 million building this place, and every time I visited, I bluntly told him it looked far less like a home, and much more like a high-tech fortress designed to keep humanity out. He would just gently laugh and say that in his specific line of work in cybersecurity, keeping people out was the entire point. Now, as I parked my battered truck 2 blocks away, under the dense cover of a massive weeping willow tree, I understood that he was absolutely right. The fortress was locked down tight, and I was the hostile invader. I pulled my jacket collar up against the relentless Seattle drizzle and began to walk. My heavy boots felt like lead on the pavement. I strictly stuck to the deep shadows, actively avoiding the pools of orange light cast by the expensive street lamps. This was an exclusive gated community, the kind of pretentious place where wealthy neighbors sued you if your grass grew half an inch too high, and armed private security patrols were far more common than delivery trucks. I saw the patrol car long before I heard it. A white SUV with yellow strobe lights flashing silently on its roof was crawling down the street. It was a private security firm, the incredibly expensive kind that Monica had insisted on hiring immediately after Lucas made his first million. I pressed myself completely flat against the wet, rough bark of a large oak tree, holding my breath. The vehicle moved past me very slowly, its thick tires hissing on the wet asphalt. I clearly saw the armed guard inside scanning the perimeter with a spotlight. Monica had likely given them strict, explicit orders before her flight to Mexico. No visitors. Especially not the father-in-law, who asked entirely too many questions. When the red taillights of the patrol car faded around the bend, I made my desperate move. I sprinted across the manicured lawn, my heart hammering violently against my ribs like a jackhammer. I am 72 years old. I have replaced both of my knees, and my lower back painfully aches whenever it rains. But tonight I moved with the desperate, frantic agility of a man half my age. I reached the front porch and flattened myself against the wall, right next to the main entrance. The front door was a massive slab of solid, polished obsidian, completely featureless except for a small, glowing blue biometric panel. There was no keyhole. Lucas did not believe in physical keys. He said they were a massive security liability. Everything here was biometric, encrypted, and locked down. I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed my thumb firmly against the glowing scanner. Access denied. The mechanical voice was cold, polite, and unyielding. A red light pulsed once. I tried the old passcode Lucas had given me years ago on the keypad. 198. The year his mother was born. Access denied, of course. She had changed it. Monica had scrubbed my access just as thoroughly as she was actively trying to scrub me from the family. I could vividly picture her doing it, laughing, with that shirtless gardener, on the beach as she maliciously deleted my fingerprints from the system. I took a deep, shaking breath. The freezing rain was dripping from the brim of my hat directly onto my nose. I looked intensely at the glowing keypad. Code Omega. Lucas had specifically told me to use Code Omega in the text. I closed my eyes and went back to a precious memory from 30 years ago. I was in our old garage, building a complex model suspension bridge out of balsa wood and strong glue. Lucas was 10 years old, sitting beside me, wearing oversized safety goggles that kept slipping down his nose. We were physically testing the load capacity. We piled heavy metal weights onto the tiny structure until it loudly groaned. "It is going to break, Dad," Lucas had whispered, terrified. "Not yet," I had told him confidently. "It can hold more. It is built to survive the impossible." That tiny wooden bridge had held 342 pounds before finally, violently snapping. 342. It was the very first time I saw my son look at me with absolute, unfiltered awe. It was the specific number that bonded us. The blue-collar engineer and the brilliant boy who would grow up to build invisible bridges in the digital cloud. I opened my eyes, I reached out, and carefully typed the numbers into the keypad. 342. Then I added the second part of the code, the exact date he graduated from MIT. The panel blinked yellow, then a solid, beautiful green. "Welcome, Administrator Harrison." The voice was entirely different this time. It wasn't the generic, polite female AI voice. It was a perfectly synthesized version of Lucas's own voice. Hearing it, in the dark, was like a physical blow to the chest. I stood completely frozen, staring at the door as the heavy internal deadbolts disengaged with a series of deep, metallic thuds. Protocol Omega initiated, the synthesized voice continued, calm and incredibly steady. Security suppression active. You have 15 minutes before a silent alarm is sent to the primary owner's device. Suggestion. Move quickly, 15 minutes. The welcome message on the small screen faded to black. I had exactly 15 minutes before Monica's smartphone in Cancun started screaming. 15 minutes before she frantically called the local police or her hired private goons to come and arrest me for breaking and entering. I pushed the heavy obsidian door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit me first, but it was a deeply artificial, highly sterile warmth. The long hallway was completely dark, lit only by the low, recessed safety lighting along the floorboards. I quickly closed the door behind me, and the massive locks automatically slammed home, sealing me inside the fortress. I stood in the vast foyer of my dead son's house and violently shivered. It didn't smell like him anymore. Lucas always smelled like strong black coffee and old paper, even though he worked exclusively with cutting-edge computers. He loved the smell of hardbound books, but that comforting scent was completely gone. The air was overwhelmingly thick, with the harsh, stinging smell of industrial-strength bleach and lemon disinfectant. It was overpowering. It physically stung the inside of my nose. Why would an empty house need to be cleaned this incredibly thoroughly? Why would a supposedly grieving widow order a massive, chemical deep clean the exact day after her husband tragically died in a car crash miles away? I walked further into the massive living room. My heavy boots echoed loudly on the polished Italian marble floors. The expensive furniture was entirely covered in white dust sheets, looking exactly like pale ghosts in the dim light. The paintings on the walls, the expensive, chaotic abstract art Monica loved so much, were still there, but all the personal photos were gone. I walked quickly to the stone mantel, where Lucas kept his framed pictures. The beautiful photo of us fly fishing in Montana was gone. The old photo of him and his mother was gone. Even the staged, professional pictures of him and Monica were completely missing. It was as if she was actively erasing him, not just from the company, not just from her life, but from physical existence. The silence of the massive house was heavy, pressing painfully against my eardrums. I checked my wristwatch, 14 minutes left. I had to find the main computer terminal. I had to find whatever crucial evidence he had managed to leave for me. But looking closely at this empty, heavily sanitized mausoleum, a terrible sinking feeling settled deep in my gut. This wasn't just a spring cleanup. This was a brutal crime scene that had been scrubbed raw. I moved quickly toward the grand staircase, my hand sliding along the cold, brushed metal railing. I knew exactly where his primary office was, second floor, north wing, the room with the heavily reinforced walls. As I rapidly climbed the stairs, I noticed something odd on the landing. A faint dark stain on the beige carpet right near the edge of the top step. It was relatively small, no bigger than a quarter. I knelt down, my old knees screaming in loud protest. I touched it, it was completely dry, but the texture was stiff and crusty. Coffee, or dark wine, or blood that the expensive cleaners had missed in their rush. I stood up, my jaw tightening until my teeth ached. The official timeline was entirely wrong. Lucas died in a fiery car crash on the interstate highway. Miles from here. That was the official police report. So why in the hell was there a bloodstain on his landing? And why did the house smell like a sterile hospital operating room? I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the long, dark hallway toward his office. The door was securely closed, 12 minutes left. I started to run, not a wild sprint, but the steady, incredibly determined jog of an engineer who knows the structure is actively collapsing and has to find the load-bearing wall before it is completely too late. I was not just fighting the ticking clock. I was fighting the massive, carefully constructed lie that had been told to the world. And as I reached for the heavy handle of his office door, I prayed that the digital fortress my son had built was far stronger than the physical one I was standing in. I had barely taken 3 steps toward the hallway when the absolute silence of the house was violently shattered. The landline on the marble console table downstairs began to ring. Its shrill mechanical cry bounced off the high ceilings, making me jump out of my skin. I froze, my heart slamming painfully against my ribs. Who calls a physical landline in this day and age? Then, the large touchscreen interface on the wall flickered brightly to life. It was the smart home communications interface, incoming call. Monica, she knew. She had seen the door unlock notification on her phone in Cancun. The incredibly expensive technology that was supposed to protect this house was now acting as her personal spy. I stared intensely at the screen. My first desperate instinct was to completely ignore it, to run down the hall and frantically find the evidence before she could stop me. But if I didn't answer, she would know instantly that something was terribly wrong. She would call the local police. She would claim I was a dangerous intruder. I needed to buy time. I needed to play the exact role she fully expected, the deeply confused, heavily grieving old man. I walked quickly back to the console and picked up the heavy receiver. My hand was shaking, but I forced my voice to be as steady as possible. "Hello, Harrison? Is that you?" Her voice was incredibly weak, breathy, and laced with pain. It was an absolute masterpiece of acting. If I hadn't seen that high-resolution photo of her holding a margarita 2 minutes ago, I would have firmly believed she was on her deathbed in the clinic. "Monica," I said, expertly injecting a note of fatherly worry into my tone. "I am at the house. Your mother said you were in the hospital. Are you all right?" "Oh, Dad," she let out a soft, pathetic whimper. "It has been awful. The doctors say it was severe anaphylactic shock, stress induced from the grief. I can barely physically lift my head. I saw the security alert that the front door opened. I got so scared I thought it was a burglar. I listened very closely. Beneath her whispered, theatrical lies. I could hear it. The faint, rhythmic whoosh of ocean waves, and then something else, a man's laugh, low, guttural, and deeply relaxed. It was Jack's. He was right there next to her on the beach, probably refilling her tequila, while she brazenly lied to the father of the man she had just buried. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. The violent urge to scream at her, to call her a liar and a murderous gold digger, was so incredibly strong it tasted like raw copper in my mouth. But I swallowed it down. I am an engineer. I work with extreme pressure. I do not explode until I choose to. "I am so sorry to startle you, Monica," I said, my voice intentionally flat and slightly lost. I needed to be close to him today. I came to get the framed photo of Lucas, the one from his graduation. I want to put it on my mantle. I hope you don't mind." There was a tense pause on the line. She was calculating, carefully evaluating my lie against her own. "Of course, Dad," she said, synthetic sweetness dripping from her words like poison honey. "Take anything you need, but please do not stay long. The alarm system is very sensitive, and I do not want the police showing up and upsetting you. You know how confused you get sometimes." I bristled, confused. That was her narrative now, painting me as the senile old man who couldn't be trusted. "I will be quick," I promised. As she continued to ramble on about her imaginary medical treatments, my eyes wandered to the sleek, stainless steel trash compactor in the kitchen. The heavy lid was slightly ajar. A piece of packaging was sticking out. It was bright, aggressive orange. I walked over to it, stretching the landline cord to its absolute limit. "Dad, are you still there?" she asked, her voice sharpening slightly. "Yes, I am here," I said, acting distracted, just looking for the photo. I pulled the heavy trash drawer open. It was mostly empty, completely scrubbed, except for a few empty protein shake bottles. Lucas lived on those things, but right on top of the bottles was a small, heavy glass vial. The label had been partially torn off, but I could clearly read the words Vitality Supplement. I picked it up. It felt strangely heavy. I uncorked it and sniffed. The smell hit me instantly, and it was entirely wrong. It was not vitamins. It was not protein powder. It was chemical, sharp, and incredibly acrid. It smelled exactly like the toxic industrial solvent we used to strip heavy rust off steel girders. My stomach violently churned. This was what she had been feeding him, vitality. She had been poisoning him slowly, right under everyone's noses. "Dad," her voice was loud now, demanding and suspicious. "What is that noise? What are you doing?" I realized I had let the heavy metal drawer slam shut. "Nothing," I said quickly, dropping the heavy glass vial into my jacket pocket. I bumped into a chair. I am a bit clumsy today. The grief, you know." There was a very long silence on the other end. The sound of the Mexican waves seemed to get significantly louder. The man's laughter had completely stopped. "Dad," she said, and the pathetic weakness was entirely gone from her voice. It was cold now, hard as ice. "Leave the house now, you sound very unwell. I am calling the private security patrol to physically escort you home for your own safety." She sensed the subtle change in my tone. The game was up. I did not say goodbye. I did not patiently wait for her to finish her threat. I slammed the heavy receiver back onto the cradle, completely severing the connection. I stood there in the silent kitchen, my chest heaving. The clock in my head was ticking louder than ever. She would call the guards immediately. They would be here in minutes. My smartphone buzzed in my pocket, a text message, but not from Lucas this time. It was a critical notification from the security system again, the one Lucas had given me administrator access to. It was actively intercepting outgoing text messages from the primary user's phone. Outgoing message to Jax: "Get to the private jet now. The old man knows something. We have to clean this up tonight." I stared at the screen in pure horror. They were coming, not just the local guards, but Monica and Jax. They were flying back tonight to permanently finish the job. I looked up at the high ceiling toward the second floor, where the server room waited. Fear washed over me, cold and paralyzing. I was just an old man with a bad back and a heavy wrench in his truck. What could I possibly do against them? Then I touched the vial in my pocket. I thought of Lucas lying silently in that muddy casket. I thought of the balsa wood bridge we built together that held 342 pounds. "I am not just an old man," I whispered fiercely to the empty, sterile room. "I am a father, and you are about to find out exactly what happens when you try to break a structure that was explicitly built to last." I turned and ran back toward the stairs. I had hard evidence to find and a brutal war to start. I took the stairs two at a time, completely ignoring the burning, agonizing protest in my 72-year-old knees. The pure adrenaline coursing through my veins entirely masked the physical pain, replacing it with a singular, terrifying focus. I reached the landing and sprinted down the hallway of the north wing. The heavy door to Lucas's office was closed but unlocked. I threw it open, and the familiar smell of him finally hit me: old paper, stale coffee, and that faint, underlying scent of ozone that always seems to stubbornly linger around high-voltage electronics. The office was incredibly dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the ongoing storm outside. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I could not risk being seen from the driveway if Monica and Jax's private security arrived early. I moved by pure memory and by the faint gray light filtering through the edges of the drapes. My phone buzzed again with a final automated instruction from the security system. "Look for the Roman Empire." I knew exactly what that meant. On the massive mahogany bookshelf that covered the entire east wall, there was a beautiful leather-bound collection I had proudly given Lucas for his 30th birthday, The History of Roman Engineering. It was his absolute favorite set. He used to say that the ancient Romans truly understood that a society is only as strong as the physical roads that connect it. I found the books. They were on the third shelf, exactly at eye level. I pulled firmly on the thick spine of volume IV. It did not tilt forward like a normal book. Instead, it clicked, a soft, incredibly satisfying mechanical sound, like the heavy tumbler of a bank safe falling perfectly into place. The entire section of the heavy bookcase swung open, silent and smooth on hidden steel hinges, revealing the heavy steel door directly behind it. This was the panic room, the server farm, the digital brain of the entire house. I pushed the steel door open and stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly. The room was meticulously kept at a constant 60 degrees to protect the highly sensitive equipment. The hum was significantly louder here, a steady pulsing drone of cooling fans and rapidly spinning hard drives. Rows of blue and green LED lights blinked in the darkness, looking exactly like the eyes of 1,000 watching insects. In the absolute center of the room sat a single modern desk with 3 massive curved monitors. I sat down heavily in the chair. It was an expensive ergonomic mesh chair, and it was perfectly molded to the exact shape of my son's body. Sitting in it felt like a massive violation and a warm hug all at once. I placed my trembling hands on the desk. The center monitor instantly flickered to life, detecting my presence. There was no password prompt this time. The master system had fully verified me at the front door with the Omega code. Instead, there was just a single, isolated video file resting in the exact center of the black screen. The file name was simply Dad. My finger hovered nervously over the enter key. I was an engineer. I was entirely used to looking at complex blueprints that clearly showed me exactly how a massive building would confidently stand or violently fall. But looking at that simple file, I knew in my gut I was about to see the brutal blueprint of my only son's destruction. I pressed the key, the video player opened. The digital timestamp in the corner showed it was recorded exactly 7 days ago. When Lucas's face appeared on the large screen, I let out a terrible sound that was half gasp and half sob. He looked horrific. The incredibly handsome, vibrant man I had proudly raised, the healthy man who enthusiastically ran marathons and hiked tall mountains, looked exactly like a walking ghost. His skin was a sickly, translucent yellow. His eyes, usually so bright and sharp, were sunken deep into dark, hollow sockets. He was sweating profusely, even though he was wearing a thick wool sweater. Dad, his voice was a terrible rasp, a dry, scratching sound that violently tore at my heart. He tried desperately to smile, but it looked significantly more like a grimace of pure, unadulterated pain. If you are watching this, it means I am dead, and it means the fail-safe protocol worked. I hope you are sitting down. He paused to cough, a wet, rattling, terrifying cough that violently shook his thin frame. He took a sip of water from a glass on his desk. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Dad, because I do not have much time left. My kidneys are completely shutting down. I can feel it happening. The doctors at the urgent care said it was a severe viral infection, but they are entirely wrong. I know exactly what is happening to me. He leaned much closer to the camera, his jaundiced yellow eyes intense and burning. Monica is poisoning me. She has been doing it for months. It is in the protein shakes she makes me every single morning. She mixes it with the vanilla powder, so I cannot taste the sweetness. But I know the symptoms. It is ethylene glycol, antifreeze. I completely froze in the chair. My hand went instinctively to the jacket pocket, where I had hurriedly stashed the vial from the trash can. Ethylene glycol. It is a heavy industrial solvent. It is incredibly sweet. It is practically odorless. And it utterly destroys the kidneys, slowly forming jagged crystals that literally tear the vital organs apart from the inside. It is a slow, agonizing way to die. Why didn't I go to the police? Lucas continued, sounding as if he were reading my frantic mind. Why didn't I tell you sooner? He looked down at his pale hands, which were trembling uncontrollably. Because she has leverage, Dad, terrible, unbreakable leverage. About 6 months ago, she installed hidden cameras in our bedroom. She hired a team of black market hackers to create deepfake videos. Highly realistic AI-generated footage. In these videos, I am a monster. I am violently beating her. I am emotionally abusing her. I am doing terrible things that would make you vomit to watch. Lucas looked up again, and a single tear tracked slowly through the heavy sweat on his cheek. She told me that if I tried to leave her, or if I dared go to the police, she would release the videos to the global press. She would completely destroy the company. The stock would tank overnight. Thousands of innocent employees would lose their jobs. But that is not why I stayed silent. He took a long, incredibly ragged breath. She said she would firmly frame you. 2. She has meticulously falsified emails on your computer, Dad. Emails that make it look exactly like you knew about the abuse, like you actively covered it up. She said she would send you to federal prison as an accessory. She said she would let you die in a concrete cell, labeled as a monster who raised a monster. I gripped the hard edge of the desk so incredibly hard, I thought the thick wood might physically splinter. My son, my foolish, noble, brilliant son, he had actively let himself be slowly murdered just to protect my reputation. He had absorbed the horrific poison day by day, sip by agonizing sip, just to keep me safely insulated from a massive lie. I could not let that happen, Lucas whispered, his voice rapidly fading. I could not let her destroy the name Caldwell, so I made a choice. I stopped taking the medical antidotes I was secretly sourcing. I let nature take its brutal course, but I did not go quietly. He pointed a shaking, pale finger directly at the camera lens. I have compiled absolutely everything. The massive bank transfers where she paid the hackers in Russia. The raw footage of the deepfakes before they were fully rendered. And the secret audio recordings of her talking to Jax about the lethal dosage. It is all explicitly here on this primary hard drive. But Dad, you need to be extremely careful. She is not working alone. Jax is incredibly dangerous. He has a violent criminal record in Florida that she paid heavily to have sealed. The screen flickered. Lucas was physically struggling to stay upright in the chair. You have to take the drive, Dad. Take it directly to Sterling. Do not trust the local police precinct. Monica has already paid off the shift commander. You have to go federal. He slowly leaned back, closing his eyes in pain for a long moment. I am so sorry. I am leaving you completely alone. I am sorry I cannot be the son who buries his father. But please know that I loved you enough to firmly die for you. Do not let her win. Do not let her take the house. Do not let her take the legacy. Burn it all down if you have to, but do not let her win. The video violently ended. The massive screen went completely black, leaving me staring directly at my own reflection. I saw an old broken man with tears streaming down his face into his gray beard. But I also saw something else entirely. I saw the cold, unyielding eyes of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I sat there for a long moment, quietly weeping in that cold, humming room. I cried for the unimaginable pain he must have bravely endured. I cried for the profound loneliness of his final days. He had died in this very chair, completely alone, while his wife actively planned tropical vacations with her lover. But then, the tears stopped. They didn't dry up, they just turned to solid ice. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy vial of poison. I forcefully set it on the desk next to the keyboard. You did your part, son, I whispered to the dark screen. You held the massive weight as long as you possibly could. Now, let me take the load. Before I could reach down to the tower of the computer to carefully extract the hard drive, the screen that had held my son's last words suddenly turned a violent, pulsing, angry red. A new window popped up in the exact center of the monitor. It was a progress bar. System purge initiated, unauthorized access detected, remote deletion in progress, 10% complete. I stared at it. For a split second, I was paralyzed. It was Monica. She was likely sitting in that hotel room or on her private jet, triggering the failsafe to permanently erase the last remnants of her husband's existence. She wasn't just killing him, she was actively unmaking him. 12%. I grabbed the computer mouse and violently shook it, frantically trying to find a cancel button or an abort sequence on the screen. There was none. I pounded on the mechanical keyboard, hitting escape, hitting enter, hitting every single key I could rapidly reach. Nothing happened. The digital numbers just kept relentlessly climbing. 15%. I am not a coder. I do not logically know how to write scripts, hack firewalls, or bypass complex cybersecurity protocols. I deal heavily in concrete and steel. I deal in physical things I can actually touch, things I can confidently measure, things I can break. And right now, I was helplessly watching the only irrefutable evidence that could avenge my son and save my own life being eaten by invisible digital termites. 18%. Think, listen, think. If a massive physical bridge is actively collapsing, you do not try to mathematically redesign the physics while it falls. You sever the load, you cut the physical connection. I looked quickly at the back of the massive computer tower. A thick tangle of black cables snaked out of it, disappearing into the wall. I reached around and violently yanked the heavy Ethernet cable. The plastic clip snapped off, but the thick wire came free. I looked back at the screen, desperately expecting the progress bar to halt. 22%. It was still climbing, wireless of course. Lucas had meticulously built redundancies upon redundancies. The system had instantly switched to a backup satellite connection the exact moment the hard line was physically cut. He was entirely too smart for his own good, and now his brilliant genius was actively working against me. 25%. I could feel the physical panic rising heavily in my throat like bitter bile. I looked frantically around the small room. I needed a heavy tool. I needed something solid. My eyes instantly landed on a decorative item resting on the bookshelf. A vintage solid iron railroad spike, Lucas proudly used as a paperweight. It was incredibly solid, incredibly heavy, and completely cold. I grabbed it. 30%. I did not hesitate for a microsecond. I violently swung the heavy iron spike down onto the tempered glass side panel of the massive computer tower. The glass shattered with a loud, explosive crash, showering the expensive carpet with 1,000 glittering diamonds. I dropped the heavy spike and reached inside the humming machine. The physical heat hit me instantly. The components were running at maximum capacity. The cooling fans were screaming like small jet engines, desperately trying to cool the processors that were actively working overtime to destroy themselves. It was exactly like reaching directly into the belly of an active furnace. 35% I saw it, the primary hard drive. It was a thick black rectangular block screwed tightly into a solid metal cage near the bottom of the case. I quickly tried to turn the knurled thumb screws, but they were hot. Searingly, incredibly hot. I hissed in sharp pain, violently pulling my hand back. My fingertips were already bright red and actively blistering. 40%. I didn't have time for physical pain. I didn't have time to be careful or methodical. I jammed my large hand back inside, completely ignoring the intense burning sensation that shot up my arm. I firmly grabbed the drive casing with both hands. The hot metal bit deeply into my skin. The heat was intense enough to cook raw meat. I grit my teeth so incredibly hard, I actually felt a molar violently crack. I pulled, the heavy screws held, German engineering, solid, unyielding, 45%. I braced my heavy boot against the solid wood of the desk. I grabbed the hot drive again. This time, I didn't try to patiently unscrew it. I pulled with the maximum leverage of a man who has spent 50 years physically bending thick rebar. I pulled with the pure, unadulterated anger of a father who has just watched his son die on a screen. I roared, a guttural, aggressive animal sound that violently echoed in the small room. Thick metal actively screeched against thick metal. The cage violently bent, the strong aluminum frame of the computer case warped. 50%, with one final agonizing, explosive heave, I violently ripped the drive free. The thick SATA cables violently snapped, with a sharp sound exactly like a pistol shot. The heavy power connector tore loose, sparking a brilliant blue against the chassis. I fell backward, landing incredibly hard on the carpeted floor, the hot drive clutched tightly against my chest. I looked quickly up at the monitors, signal lost, boot device missing. The aggressive red progress bar was completely gone. The screen was dead. I lay there panting heavily, the sharp smell of ozone, electrical sparks, and burnt plastic filling the cold air. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I looked down at them. My palms were severely blistered, angry red welts rapidly rising on the skin. Thick blood was slowly trickling from a deep cut on my thumb where the sharp metal of the shattered case had sliced me. But the drive was safe. It was actively cooling against my thick shirt. It was heavy. It physically felt like the massive weight of a human soul. I sat up, wincing loudly as my lower back protested the fall. I slipped the heavy drive securely into the inside breast pocket of my jacket, zipping it tightly shut. It was safe. I had done it, and then I heard it through the thick reinforced walls of the panic room, past the heavy velvet curtains of the office. Tires screeching, not the distant rhythmic wail of city police sirens. This was a sharp, piercing squeal, followed by the aggressive roar of an engine revving incredibly high. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the intense pain in my burned hands. I moved quickly to the window and cautiously peeked through the smallest crack in the heavy drapes. Bright headlights swept across the front lawn, illuminating the driving rain in silver streaks. A massive black SUV skidded to a halt directly in front of the ornate fountain. It wasn't the police. The heavy door flew violently open. A man confidently stepped out. He was physically huge, wearing a dark raincoat. Even in the dark, I instantly recognized the aggressive swagger, the sheer arrogance. Jax. He hadn't stayed in Cancun. He had flown immediately back, or maybe he never even left. And the photo had simply been staged earlier. He looked up at the house. He looked right at the specific window where I was standing. He reached into his coat and pulled out something that glinted sharply in the security lights. It was a heavy, solid steel tire iron. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering a completely new, terrifying rhythm. I had the absolute truth safely in my pocket, but the truth is entirely useless if you are murdered before you can logically tell it. I looked at the heavy steel door of the server room. I looked at the shattered computer. I was completely trapped, and the wolf was actively at the door. I let the heavy velvet curtain fall back into place. My heart was beating so incredibly hard against my ribs, I was afraid the sheer sound would give me away. I looked around the server room. It was a steel box, a physical cage. There was absolutely no other exit. I was trapped in the very sanctuary my son had built to keep his secrets safe. And now, his killers were walking up the driveway, I heard the massive front door violently crash open downstairs. Jax had not bothered attempting a code. He had kicked it in. The sound of splintering heavy wood and shattering glass echoed up the massive stairwell like a cannon shot. "Find him, Jax." Monica's voice drifted up from the foyer. It was high, shrill, and completely unhinged, violently cutting through the silence of the house. "I want that old man found, and I want whatever he took from this house." I looked down at my hands. They were violently trembling, not from age, but from a potent mixture of pure rage and massive adrenaline that felt exactly like electricity in my blood. My right hand was wrapped tightly around the hard drive. My left hand was entirely empty. I needed a weapon. I scanned the server room. It was filled entirely with delicate electronics, blinking lights and plastic fans. Not exactly a heavy armory. Then, my eyes rapidly landed on a small technician's toolkit hanging casually on the side of the main server rack. Lucas liked to do his own maintenance. I reached out and unrolled the thick canvas pouch. There it was, a heavy ball-peen hammer. It was relatively small, primarily used for gently tapping pins into place, but it was solid forged steel with a thick rubberized grip. I grabbed it. It felt heavy and deeply reassuring. It was a builder's tool, but tonight, it would have to serve a vastly different purpose. I heard heavy, aggressive footsteps thudding on the stairs. They were moving incredibly fast. Jax was taking the steps 2 at a time. "Check the master bedroom," Monica yelled from somewhere in the kitchen. "I will violently check the safe." She was actively worried about the cash. Even now, with a hostile witness loose in the house, her absolute first instinct was to greedily secure the money. That sheer greed was her massive weakness, but Jax was vastly different. Jax was an aggressive predator. I heard him reach the second-floor landing. He completely stopped. I held my breath. I pressed my back against the cold steel of the server racks, actively trying to make myself as physically small as possible. The hidden door was brilliantly disguised as a bookshelf. It was an absolute masterpiece of engineering, entirely seamless, but it was not soundproof. I smelled ozone. I sniffed the air. The heavy burnt smell from the computer I had just violently destroyed was slowly filling the small room, leaking out into the hallway. If that smell reached him, the illusion of the bookshelf would be entirely useless. I smelled the sharp ozone. The burnt smell from the computer I had just violently destroyed was slowly filling the small room, leaking out into the hallway. If that acrid smell reached him, the clever illusion of the bookshelf would be entirely useless. I heard Jax's heavy boots slowly step into the office. He was breathing heavily, a low, aggressive rasp. "I smell burning plastic, old man," Jax called out, his voice a mocking, aggressive taunt. "You playing with things you don't understand." He knew about the panic room. Monica must have told him exactly where it was. I heard the heavy books shifting. I heard the solid click of the Roman engineering volume being pulled. The heavy steel door began to slowly swing inward. I didn't cower in the corner. I didn't beg for my life. I am an engineer. I analyze the structural weaknesses of my environment and exploit them. The doorway was narrow. Jax was a massive, heavily muscled man. To enter the room, he would have to turn his shoulders slightly and step heavily over the thick metal threshold. As the heavy door swung wide, revealing Jax holding the solid steel tire iron exactly like a baseball bat, I made my aggressive move. I didn't aim the heavy ball-peen hammer at his thick skull. He would block that. Instead, I dropped to one knee when his lead foot stepped heavily over the threshold, planting his entire massive weight on that leg. I swung the solid steel hammer with every ounce of physical strength I possessed directly at his left kneecap. The kneecap is an incredibly fragile structure. It is not built to withstand a lateral, concentrated impact of solid steel moving at high velocity. The loud crack of his patella shattering echoed like a rifle shot. Jax let out an ear-piercing, entirely ungodly shriek of absolute agony. His massive leg buckled backward at a sickening, unnatural angle. He violently dropped the heavy tire iron, crashing to the floor, clutching his ruined knee, and screaming obscenities that echoed through the house. I didn't hesitate. I didn't gloat. I stepped heavily right over his wreathing body and actively sprinted out of the office. "Jax!" Monica's voice screamed from the bottom of the grand staircase. "What happened?" I reached the top of the stairs just as she was frantically running up them. She was clutching a heavy duffel bag, likely filled entirely with the cash and jewelry she had frantically managed to pull from the wall safe. She froze. When she saw me standing there, completely unharmed, the bloody hammer still gripped tightly in my blistered hand. The heavy fake facade completely dropped, her beautiful face contorted into an ugly, aggressive mask of pure hatred. "You old bastard," she hissed, dropping the heavy bag and reaching into her designer jacket. But before she could pull whatever weapon she had, the entire front of the house violently exploded with light. Red and blue strobe lights painted the foyer through the massive glass windows. The deafening, aggressive wail of multiple police sirens overwhelmed the sound of the rain. The heavy front door, already violently shattered by jacks, was kicked wide open. A dozen heavily armed SWAT officers flooded into the foyer, their tactical rifles raised, harsh flashlights sweeping the stairs. "Seattle police, drop your weapons." "Get on the ground." Monica froze, her hands still inside her jacket. I slowly, deliberately dropped the heavy hammer. It clattered loudly down the marble stairs. From directly behind the wall of armed officers, a familiar, well-dressed figure emerged. It was Sterling, my attorney. He looked incredibly soaked, aggressive, and deeply furious. "Harrison," he yelled over the noise, "are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Sterling," I said, my voice carrying down the massive stairwell. "How did you know? You bolted from your own son's funeral like a madman." Sterling shouted back, "I pinged the GPS on your truck. When I saw you were at Lucas's house, I called the precinct captain. I told him I suspected an aggressive break-in." Monica threw her hands in the air, instantly switching back to her pathetic, aggressive victim persona. "Officers, thank God!" she cried, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "He broke in, he attacked my gardener. He is completely insane." A tactical officer grabbed her by the shoulder, spinning her around and actively slamming her against the wall to cuff her. I slowly walked down the marble stairs, my old knees popping with every step. I completely ignored Monica as she screamed and thrashed against the heavy handcuffs. I walked directly over to Sterling and the precinct captain. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the heavy glass vial of ethylene glycol. I handed it to the captain. "That is the aggressive poison she used to slowly murder my son," I said, my voice completely flat and unyielding. Then I unzipped my jacket and pulled out the heavy, burnt, warped hard drive. I handed it directly to Sterling, "And this," I said, looking at Monica, whose face had instantly drained of all blood, "is the exact blueprint of her aggressive destruction. It contains all the financial transfers, the aggressive blackmail videos, and the audio confessions." Monica completely collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the marble floor. The pathetic, aggressive wailing stopped. She just stared blankly at the burnt metal drive, completely realizing that the massive, aggressive structure of lies she had built had just violently collapsed on top of her. The ensuing trial was incredibly brief and overwhelmingly aggressive. The digital evidence Lucas had compiled was absolutely irrefutable. The aggressive bank transfers to the black market hackers in Russia. The aggressive audio recordings of her and Jax actively discussing the lethal dosage of the antifreeze. Monica and Jax were sentenced to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole for conspiracy, aggressive extortion, and first-degree murder. The massive $10 million life insurance claim was immediately voided, and all her hidden assets were seized by the state. It has been exactly 1 year since the funeral. I sold my old small house. I permanently moved into Lucas's massive, glass and steel fortress. Not because I like the architecture, but because it belongs to my grandson now. I sat on the back patio, watching Leo actively run across the manicured lawn, playfully chasing a bright red ball. He looks so incredibly much like his father, it sometimes makes my chest ache. But it is a good ache, a reminder that the aggressive foundation we built is still standing. Sterling handled the massive estate. The cybersecurity company is thriving, securely held in an ironclad trust until Leo is 25. I aggressive fired the private security firm and reprogrammed the biometric locks myself. I even traded in my old Ford for a safe, modern SUV. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp Seattle air. The heavy, aggressive rain had finally stopped, leaving the sky a bright, piercing blue. They always tell you that you must forgive family, that blood is thicker than water, They are wrong. Blood is just a biological coincidence. True family is not defined by who you share a last name with. It is defined by who is willing to take the heavy load when you can no longer stand. It is defined by who is willing to tear down the world to find the absolute truth. I looked at the massive glass walls of the house. It wasn't just a fortress anymore. It was an aggressive monument to my son's brilliant mind and his incredible sacrifice. The structure was finally sound, and as I watched my grandson laugh in the sun, I knew with absolute certainty that this bridge would never, ever fall.